Hi, I'm Nathan Dunn, the Vice President of Knowledge Translation and Impact at Places for People. And I wanted to let everyone know briefly about the mission of Illume before introducing our keynote for this afternoon. So Illume collaborates with community stakeholders to promote the uptake of evidence-based and evidence-informed practices in behavioral health organizations. We work to ensure that services are both accessible and high quality to enhance the well-being of persons with behavioral health conditions. Support for Illume comes generously from the Missouri Foundation for Health. And I am pleased to introduce our keynote speaker for today, Dr. Gary Morse. Dr. Morse is a clinical psychologist who, soon after earning his PhD from the University of Missouri in St. Louis, founded Community Alternatives, a mental health center focused on leveraging the best available evidence to promote the well-being of persons with serious and chronic mental health conditions. In 2011, Dr. Morse spearheaded the merger of Community Alternatives with Places for People, and more recently has served as the founding director of Illume. In addition to the delivery and administration of behavioral health services, Dr. Morse has made significant contributions to the evidence base for assertive community treatment, the needs and services for persons experiencing homelessness, and addressing burnout in behavioral health workers. Dr. Morse has provided training and technical assistance on evidence-based practices to national and international audiences and has shared his research in over 70 peer-reviewed articles. I've known Gary for the past 5 years when I first became the supervisor of the research and evaluation team at Places for People. And throughout this time of him as my mentor, I've been impressed by his steadfast commitment to the well-being of behavioral health staff, as well as persons most afflicted by mental illness. His approach recognizes the dignity of the individual and is devoted to promoting the well-being among many different dimensions, whether physical, mental, or emotional. And for these reasons, above all, I hope you will find much of value in Dr. Morse's presentation today. So with that, I hand it over to him.
Thank you, Nathan. And maybe I just do a quick check whether my audio is working, and Kizzy, if you can put the PowerPoint up. Great. And is the audio working?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. And thank you, Kara, and thank you, Nathan, for that kind and generous introduction. And for those of you who don't know that, Nathan recently became the next director of Illume, which is something that I'm very glad about, that Nathan is also an incredibly dedicated, talented, and caring person. So I think there'll be great things ahead with Illume and for Illume and the community and with all the staff that work there. I also wanted to welcome everyone for joining this webinar today. We're glad to have you here as it's a really critical, important time. We're emerging collectively and individually from one of the most difficult periods in modern history. We're not here today to dwell on past problems, but as a starting point, it is important to be aware of the plethora of difficulties that millions of people have faced during the pandemic. These problems are generally well known, but for a quick summary, as shown on the next slide, slide 3, are the health effects, with 185 million people now who've been infected, known infections worldwide with COVID-19. That includes more than 33 million people in the United States. There have been 4 million known deaths in the world, 606,000 of those in the United States. And in addition, a number of people are continuing suffering what's called the long haulers, the lingering symptoms of COVID. In addition to the health, there have been severe economic impacts of millions of people who've lost their jobs, thousands of businesses that closed, reduced income, and financial distress on millions of people. The social impacts have also been severe, with social restrictions that I think we've never known in the United States, that have felt really kind of gone against the grain of our sense of American freedom, with restrictions and recommendations about what we can do or not do socially. And closures of in-person education and schools, which placed stresses on students and also on parents who served as teachers for their children while working from home. There's also been an increase in relationship conflicts, divorce, relationship abuse, and a number of people who have suffered from social isolation during the pandemic. There's also been what some people have called the second pandemic wave, which has been a surge in mental health and behavioral health problems, and that's include increased mental health symptoms and disorders like depression and anxiety, suicide, declining happiness and well-being, increase in alcohol use, and overeating, what's been called pandemic pounds, which has been significant for many people. I also want to note that we've gone through a lot more than the coronavirus pandemic in the past 16 months. We saw the brutal, traumatic killing of George Floyd at the knee of a white policeman that was captured on video that brought home in a new and powerful, disturbing way the systemic racism that has existed in the United States. We've also seen unknown political conflict, most dramatically evidenced by the attack on the US Capitol, and political divisions among the main political parties and the people of this country. And in addition, there's been increased gun violence. Suffice it to say, it's been a very challenging time with major stresses, though there's also some positives, which we'll explore later. Now on the next slide, let's just take on slide 4, a quick look at some of the emerging realities in the current situation. First of all, we've all survived and we're moving ahead now in positive, visible ways. There's greatly reduced infection and death rates, improved economics, increased social contact. We can travel again, we can go to restaurants and sporting events and concerts, and we see more and more the human face instead of a mass society that was necessary during the pandemic. These are certainly changes and events to celebrate. They're changes that buoy our spirits, but the new normal isn't necessarily the old normal. And some people will never be able to go back the way it was because of things like deceased loved ones, lost jobs, enduring economic realities, and lingering health problems. Some have also developed and dealing with unhealthy habits that came about during the pandemic. And now for some, there are new anxieties about returning to work or other social situations. And while there's much reason for optimism about battling the virus itself, there's still some cautions and uncertainties about the future for the nation and the world. Questions such as, will we be able to reach and maintain herd immunity, particularly given vaccine hesitancy and refusals, the emergence of new variants of the coronavirus, and whether vaccines will continue to be highly effective against all strains in the future. There's also ongoing severe pandemic continues in many parts of the world, and ongoing social and political division and problems. In some important ways, despite the positive changes, we continue to live in an era of uncertainty and challenges. As on the next slide, it's a time of opportunity as well as challenge. Fortunately, we all survived the pandemic, but life can and should be about more than survival. We have the potential to do more than to return to past ways. We have the capability to be more, to thrive, to be our best. And emerging from the pandemic gives us an opportunity for conscious living instead of automatically trying to return to the old normal in an unquestioned way. Specifically, we can consciously focus on recovering and seize this time as an opportunity to deepen our ways of living, to find new growth, to thrive, to step back and consider the question of how we can be at our best. This webinar will focus on strategies for recovering and thriving. On the next PowerPoint, you can see that we'll be talking about some stages and strategies. In particular, we'll discuss two stages, 7 strategies with multiple methods and techniques. The 2 stages which overlap are one, recovery, and two, growing and thriving. The strategies we cover today will involve some basic instruction and suggestions and some simple tools or exercises for personal use. We'll briefly do some of those exercises so that you have a feel, not just information, but actually a feel for some of the exercises. The caveat up front is in general, these techniques are not new, but rather for the most part, they're evidence-based methods used in cognitive behavioral therapy and well-being and happiness approaches. They're used to cope with stress, to improve mental health, and increase personal happiness. Although methods are not new, the premise for this webinar is that one or more of these strategies may be of personal benefit to you, especially as you consider them in the context of the pandemic stresses and in the particulars of your own life, especially how you want to recover and how you want to be at your best. For those of you in helping professions, there may also be ideas or strategies for supporting the work you do with others in their recovery and their growth. So let's start with the recovery stage and its three major strategies. On the next PowerPoint 7, we can begin to look at recovery, and the first strategy is really taking stock. As I said before, our premise is that we don't want to dwell on the negative, but it is an important starting place for recovery, as it's better to be aware and face hardships than to deny and avoid reality. So I would ask you to consider the areas and ways this period has created difficulties for you. And if we could put up the poll question number 1, which asks, what stresses, difficulties, and problems did you experience during the pandemic period? So we'd like you to conduct a webinar poll. We'd like you to check the general categories are the ones that apply. Those are health impacts, and there's some particulars that illustrate the health impacts, the emotional impact, social family impacts, other behavioral health, work or economic. Also, there's been lost celebrations and opportunities that some people have even felt difficulty about, but there are things like, hey, we weren't able to attend our son's graduation, or he wasn't able to go to graduation, or there were weddings postponed or baby showers. There were a lot of canceled vacations, some of which were significant. Those are all still part of the fabric of loss that occurred during this period, however, or any other significant stress or difficulty. So if you could take a moment, and we would like to do the in-webinar poll survey on that and mark any and all of those that apply to your personal experience during this past 16 months of the pandemic and the related events that have occurred. And Kizzy, is it Kizzy who's monitoring the poll responses?
I got the polls, and so we got about 88% in. We can hang on for like 10 more seconds if anybody else wants to vote.
Thanks, Kara.
Mm-hmm.
Kara, do you mind briefly saying what those results are?
Sure. So it looks like most people had emotional impacts from the pandemic or social family impacts. Then we also, since you were able to pick multiple things, those were the two highest. Then we also have lost celebrations and opportunities, which makes a lot of sense. And then other behavioral health issues was at about 48%. Then lower, but still significant, was other significant stress and difficulties, work and economic issues, and health impact.
Kara, thank you for sharing that. And I think that speaks again to just the widespread impact of this past 16 months and how it's affected so many people's lives in a myriad of ways. What we'd like to do now is just kind of ask you, that was kind of a broad brush overview of your own survey of the areas of your life that were affected. And on the next PowerPoint 8, we could put that up. We'd also like you to think about, you went through and you marked everything that affected you. Maybe just take a moment to zero in the most challenging issue that you have faced. What's affected you the most? And what, if anything, continues to affect you? Say that again, not to have anyone dwell in the negative, but again, part of moving forward sometimes is having a marker of what have you gone through, and that can be a stepping stone for your own recovery and growth. So that's something you can just note to yourself, or you can jot it down on a piece of paper, or as we said, just make that a simple mental note. So now let's move on the next slide to some of the issues or some of the strategies for helping us deal with the things that have happened. So the first one we could call making peace. So there are multiple methods to do that. And one of the most important ones is the very simple but sometimes difficult practice of practicing acceptance. Nothing we can do will eliminate all the difficulties and losses we experience in life. All of us are going to sometimes react emotionally to difficult situations with things like denial or anger or hurt or avoidance. It's normal to have such feelings, but the critical issue is to allow ourselves to move forward without getting stuck in those feelings, without letting upset feelings fester. Sometimes that festering can create secondary suffering that can take on a life of its own and even become more impactful than the initial problem. For example, sometimes people get stuck in self-pity or anger or despair in a way that allows or that prevents them from moving forward. However, we can improve our well-being by learning acceptance. And acceptance does not necessarily mean liking a situation or event, nor does it necessarily mean resigning ourselves that that situation will always remain the same in the future. It doesn't mean, however, that we improve our coping and our emotions by seeing reality as it is, instead of denying, avoiding, or excessively railing against the reality. So on the next handout, handout 10, there's some very simple, basic ideas about how one can practice acceptance. This is a part of a number of different therapies. For example, in dialectical behavior therapy, it's sometimes called radical acceptance. And again, this is going to be familiar to many clinicians, but when you're feeling distress, just identify what the triggering event or memory is and your negative thoughts or feelings, especially the ones that are repetitive and keep you stuck and kind of going around in a little eddy or whirlpool of negative feelings. And then try to, and it's difficult sometimes, try to take an attitude of acceptance in the present moment about that situation and also about your feelings. You can tell yourself, it is what it is, which is again a saying that's used a lot. I like adding a little clause to that. It is what it is today, because again, we can sometimes change some of these situations in the future. Also, as we do that, that begins to give us some leverage toward those negative feelings, but we can also take just a few deep breaths to relax and center ourselves. We can also make an intention or do a meditation of loving kindness, which is not something we're going to cover today, but a very well-known method of loving kindness meditations. And we can get you more information through the center, or you can find that on the web. You can also brainstorm sometimes a plan about how would you like to address the situation, because it is what it is today, but things can change, or many things can change in the future. So on the next slide, a compatible strategy is letting go. And that is, rather than denying problems, sometimes we hold on to losses and other negative experiences in ways that continue our suffering and prevent us from living healthier, happier lives. One caveat up front here is that letting go does not necessarily mean forgetting about what's happened, particularly the positive aspects, such as a loved one who's died. Remember a long time ago reading, kind of the traditional wisdom by many mental health professionals is to tell people to let go, for example, to let go of a loved one. And yet the reality is that many people recover from that, not by letting go, but by keeping the person in a certain way. So we can hold on to, certainly something I've done over loved ones that I've lost, keep the loved one in your heart, or in your prayers and meditations in love. And at the same time, while we maybe hold onto that person or onto our relationship or the feelings and the memories, we can try and let go of some portion of the painful emotions, such as the sadness or guilt or depression or despair that can accompany loss and other difficult past events. There's several different techniques to facilitate letting go, including work on grief and loss, which will be covered in an August webinar by Illume trainer Karen Franke in more detail. For right now, we'd like to just cover 3 very basic, simple, and compatible techniques, beginning with, again, this is something many of you will be familiar with, deep or conscious breathing, which can be a helpful step. The deep and conscious breathing brings emotional relief, and this is shown on the next slide. You can begin by identifying your diaphragm, which is at the bottom of your stomach. Often it's helpful to put our hand on our belly and just to do this slow and conscious inhale. And slowly and consciously exhale. And as we do that, to really observe the inhale and the exhale. And also we can notice there's a little bit of a pause between both the inhale and the exhale. Just to observe those breaths, including the space in between. It's also, as many of you know, helpful as we do the deep breathing to take a very relaxed, passive attitude to any thoughts that might pop up, and just to be able to kind of note them and let them go. A second technique can be used, and it can be used in combination with deep breathing or on its own, is the use of imagery. An example of that may be that a person may have gone through let's say a traumatic situation of great financial difficulty during the pandemic, but that's now in the past and it continues to affect them. So what we can do with that is to kind of imagine that situation as we breathe out, imagine that we're blowing out that painful experience with our breath. So you can imagine letting it go, blowing out with your exhale. And there's other ways of imagery too. Sometimes we can imagine that we're putting it on a boat and sending it out to sea, or that we're rinsing it off and washing it away in the shower. In addition to the imagery, there are also rituals that we can use. Many people find it helpful to be able to journal about difficult past or traumatic situations and loss. And then when you journal about it, you also have options. Sometimes you can bury that as a sign that you've put it behind you, or you can make a little paper boat and float it away. Or sometimes people find it helpful to have a little campfire and to throw that into the fire, all as symbolic ways that help us to let go. On the next slide, a third of the 4 strategies for excuse me, for recovery is connecting. And that involves kind of developing or reconnecting with positive social connections, which are very important. There's, as many of you know, a great literature on the importance of social support and connection, relationships for our general health, as well as our emotional well-being. The first step to that is very simple, though sometimes it's difficult to pull off, especially it was during the pandemic, and that is to spend time with people who are positive for you, who are positive to be around. That is the people with whom you feel positive energy, happiness, and goodness in being with. So just as we treat ourselves to a favorite dessert, so too we can learn to treat ourselves with people who are good for our well-being by spending time with them. Again, we may need to consciously rebuild those connections, or we may need to develop new ones after this period of social distancing that was so prevalent during the pandemic. So on the slide, and it's also in handout number 3, what we'd like you to do is think about, first, make a list of the people who you feel positive and happy when you're with them. Perhaps try to list at least 2, maybe up to 5 people whose company allows you to feel better, to feel good. As you think about or you jot down the names of those people, you might also just want to ask yourself, how much time are you spending with them now? And did it decrease over this period of the pandemic? And even more importantly, can you put a star by the name of 2 people, or note those in your head about people who you'd like to increase time with? Because when you're with them, you feel good, but it's just kind of atrophied in terms of that social time or connection with them. And then can you write down one positive, fun, or meaningful, or joyful, good activity that you could plan to do with that person, ideally within the next week or 2? And obviously there's a whole range of things that we have more options now than we did during the pandemic for face-to-face contact and social events out in the community. And finally, can you make an intention or a plan to contact at least 1, ideally 2 people within the next week, and ask them to get together and to spend some time or to do an activity together? So sometimes just that simple act of getting with people, and people who make us laugh and make us feel good, can be really healing and positive. The other thing just quickly we want to mention on PowerPoint slide number 13 is that it's very simple, but often we kind of forget about some of the basic skills that allow us to have positive times with people. There's a number of positive social skills. The most important one I would suggest would be communication skills. These are very basic skills, but in practice, sometimes many of us slip away from those. So those basic skills include things like listening closely and focusing our attention on the person without distraction, and paying attention not only to what the person is saying, but trying to understand the person's feelings. What's maybe the emotion underneath the words? And while we don't want to interrupt, occasionally it's useful to paraphrase back what we're hearing the person say to make sure that we're understanding, and as a way to reinforce that person for their sharing. We want to convey an interest in the person and their story. And the other thing is that we want to, and again, I think this often gets lost, particularly maybe in the relationships that are closest to us, with practicing acceptance. And that is to really avoid being judgmental or critical or negative of that person or what they say, because nothing kills conversations and damages relationships like negativity, criticism, and judgmentalism. And it's important to note, though, that while you're accepting and respecting the person, that doesn't necessarily mean you agree with that person's opinion, but that you're giving them the respect in order to continue a healthy and positive dialogue. It's also, again, a very basic thing, which many of us forget to do or don't do often enough, is to include expressions of sincere appreciation or respect or affinity or admiration for the person in a relationship. And when we do that, clearly there's research as well as common sense that tells us that builds positive feelings in the other person as they hear positives from you. And research also indicates that brings back positive feelings for you. And of course, to remember that it's not just one-sided, but we also want to share our own thoughts and feelings in conversation with people. So one fourth and final strategy that we will cover here today in terms of the first stage of recovery is on the next slide, slide 14, celebrating. And in that way, we said that at the beginning of the hour here, but all of you have endured one of the most difficult periods in modern history. Fortunately, not everyone has, which is a sad effect. And that you are here now is a testament, at least in part, to your survival skills and your resilience. I also know that obviously chance sometimes plays a part in all our lives, but that we're here now also says something about your survival skills and resilience. So I'd invite you to savor, to celebrate your resilience as you begin to move forward toward your own growth and thriving, and ask you to think about for a moment what strengths of yours have helped you to survive this difficult period. You think about what you've done as maybe it was your being careful or thoughtful or intelligent or following strategies or keeping up with the news, or maybe it was more emotional, finding ways to take care of yourself, or maybe it was being able to really continue the positive social relationships. But what strength of yours has helped you to survive during this difficult period? As you finish thinking about that, we would like to put up the second poll question as indicated on slide 15. Thank you, Kara. And this is just kind of a quick review there of the things that we've talked about, of some of the strategies for recovering from the pandemic period, of taking stock, of making peace, which includes the practicing acceptance or radical acceptance, letting go, which involves the deep breathing, letting go of negative thinking, the rituals we talked about, reconnecting or connecting, and then celebrating your resilience. So what we'd ask you to do is to take a moment here and think about which of these do you think might help you after this period of the pandemic. If you could check, again, this one, you're able to check more than one, any of those that you think may be useful to you. So let's take a moment to do that.
Looks like we have a couple people still voting. I'll give it like 10, 15 more seconds.
Kara, would you mind going over the results for us?
Yeah, of course. So it looks like people are looking, or at least also encouraging their clients to reconnect and connect with others and loved ones. And then also practicing acceptance was high up there, and letting go, including deep breathing, letting go of those negative thoughts and rituals. Then also celebrating resilience. About half of responders said that they were looking forward to doing that. And about a third are looking to make peace and to take stock.
Good. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. And, it's interesting to see the diversity of responses. And, again, it looks like multiple strategies work for different things for different people, but multiple strategies. And I guess it should be no surprise after the pandemic, when one of the main strategies for so long before the vaccines was to do social distancing. That idea of reconnecting and connecting with people is one of the most important ones right now. If anybody would like to share a comment about anything they're doing related, or a question that we've covered so far on this first part about recovery, certainly feel free to do that either in chat, or if you indicate, I think Julie or Kara would be able to turn on your audio or your video. And as you think about that, the other thing that I think of is that, one of the things I think that wasn't on that list that we've suffered through within this era of the pandemic is Zoom fatigue. It's probably going to be a new disorder in DSM-6. And here we are today, we're spending more time on a webinar, which is, I appreciate everybody being here, but it's not always easy to be sitting and participating in webinars. So I also would invite us, is if you want to not only write a question or a comment, maybe to take a 30, 60-second minute just to go ahead and stretch if you'd like to do that. And if you want any suggestions about that, sometimes we do a very simple desk yoga in the burnout prevention, different ways to do that. One is kind of the idea of like just taking your shoulder blades and trying to imagine as if you were making your shoulder blades try and touch in the back, and hold that for about 5 or 6 seconds. So you feel a good stretch across your chest and maybe in your neck, and then release. Another desk yoga activity or movement is that we sometimes also use in burnout prevention is kind of the idea of a shoulder shrug. So with that, what you do is you bring your shoulders up and imagine that you could touch your shoulders to your ears. Until I have big ears, so it might be easier for me than other people. But if you can go ahead and try and do that shrug and touch your shoulders to your ears and hold that again for like 5 or 6 seconds, and then release that, and see if that gives you a little bit of a muscle tension release. Or on your own, do any other kind of stretch that you would like before we continue here. Julie, are there any comments or questions that anyone has had so far?
Yeah, there was, people clearly, like, Zoom fatigue is real, but also that on the other hand, like, video chatting was really a lifesaver during this period, because it gave us an opportunity to see others and to communicate more than just like on the phone. So some people were saying that the video chat was actually a nice thing in some ways, and that it also created opportunities that we wouldn't have thought of when we were together in person, where if you had a party, it would be just the people in town, but when you did a video or a Zoom thing, people across the country could participate. So there are some of those things that we inadvertently benefited from, that we may carry with us afterwards, because it taught us ways to stay in touch with people who are far away in a different way than we did before.
Mm-hmm.
And then someone was talking about that recently they started a monthly dinner out club or gathering, and really trying to recruit people to get together and get others from their office to join them for a monthly dinner out. So those are the two things that came through.
Well, those are great comments, great suggestions, and certainly also found that it's kind of almost like, well, I didn't think about that before, but that opportunity to get together for a Zoom meeting with somebody who lives many states away, that a dear friend, to be able to do that regularly and not just wait for the in-person visits. So maybe that's added a new skill to our repertoire for social connection. So thanks everyone for sharing that. And thanks, Julie, for giving us the summary. If there's no more questions at this time, then let's move to stage number 2, which has to do with thriving and growing to be your best. You know, during the pandemic period, it triggered for many people the downward spiral, which is a term that many of us are familiar with, and we often see in people, and unfortunately sometimes feel in our own lives when things just seem to be going downward. There's the opposite concept, though, that the research psychologist on emotions, Barbara Fredrickson, talked about, of that we can build upward spirals so that we can continue to put good things in place for ourselves so we become happier with greater emotional well-being and health. But how do we do that? There's probably a lot of different answers. For me, one of the most striking, important perspectives came from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who many of you may be familiar with for her work on death and dying. What I'm thinking about, though, comes from an autobiography that she wrote near the end of her life. And in that she wrote, "The purpose of life is to grow in our wisdom and our ability to give and to receive love." For me, I think that is an important guideline of how we can grow and how we can thrive. Now, here's some strategies about how we might consciously try and grow in our wisdom. One is, the next one is, which is strategy 5, overall, prospecting the pandemic for positives. A little bit of a tongue twister. But as difficult as the pandemic has been, it's also an opportunity to create something that's positive and wiser. This is on slide 16. And again, there's multiple techniques of how to do that. One is for looking for the positives or the silver linings. And sometimes, again, we have to consciously put our attention there. One of the resilient things about human nature is that even during the most difficult times and about life, I guess, is that we can find positive aspects. And during the pandemic, we often heard about that, of people who reported that despite all the hardships of the pandemic, their lives were less hectic. They weren't rushing about in such a frenetic pace as had been normal. They were able to stay home more and to spend more time with their immediate families and to do things they had rarely done before, like have everyone home for dinner and to feel a greater sense of connection within our immediate families. Other people were able to spend more time with their pets or adopt a pet. And some people spent more time at hobbies and the things they love. A friend and colleague of mine confessed early on in the pandemic, and she felt a little guilty, or one of those guilty pleasures, but she liked the fact that during the pandemic, she was able to be at home and have a lot more time for reading that she normally didn't have. For other people, I think the pandemic gave an opportunity to prioritize taking care of themselves and the importance of one's own personal health. So all that's possible, but we have to sometimes train or retrain our mind to see the positive, in part because of our evolutionary development and the flight or fight response. Our mind's really involved to focus on where's the threat, what's wrong, and we needed to do that in order to survive. There's a different researcher who said that the mind is like a steel trap for the negative and like Teflon for the positive. So in order to survive, we need to have the opportunity to go beyond that kind of evolutionary thinking and to be able to change or retrain our mental perspective and to see the positives that go beyond survival and to build a more positive awareness. Because that again helps us to feel better and feel happier. So it's also on handout 4 if you're interested, but I believe that's on one of the slides here too, is the idea of 3 good things, which we're adapting from some other work on emotional well-being and happiness. But again, what we'd ask you right now is, can you identify at least 1 and maybe up to 3 things that were positive that happened to you during the pandemic? Or happened during the pandemic. Those are events that can be little things, or maybe they were very major positive life events. But we'd like you to take a moment and see if you can jot it down if you like, or at least mentally think about what's at least one and maybe 3 things that were positive that happened during the pandemic. So this is a tool that we can use right now as we're coming out of the pandemic, but it's also a tool that we can use on an ongoing basis. So a very kind of radical but positive way of adapting that is to, even each day, or at least once a week, can you write down 3 positive things that happened that day or that week? Again, it kind of helps us make that mental shift from we tend to focus on problems and what went wrong to what went right. What are the positive things that are happening? Another strategy, and it's PowerPoint 17, is declaring what's positive or what's precious to you. So sometimes after major stresses or trauma or difficulties or life-threatening situations, we see things differently. We can see things more clearly, and we can understand those existential truths that life can be very fragile, and it is certainly too often fleeting, and it is precious. And that helps us to gain more appreciation for who and what is truly most important to us. So in that, I would invite you to take a moment and to write down or to think about, consider who is most precious to you in this life. Who is that person? And also, what is most precious to you in this life? Maybe it's a person, or maybe it's something else. So later, we'll probably come back and see if anyone would be willing to share anything they write down, but it's those are important touchstones. Who's precious to you, most precious? What's most precious to you? Those are things that we can hold in our heart and give us ballast as we kind of go about the storms of each day. A somewhat related strategy shown on PowerPoint 18 has to do with really sharpening or reaffirming your sense of personal meaning and purpose. It's very clear that a sense of meaning and purpose in life enriches our well-being. And meaning can also help us overcome adversity, even in the most terrible situations and hardships. One of the most classic examples of that was Viktor Frankl, who described it in his book, Man's Search for Meaning, about how his being able to get in touch with a sense of personal meaning allowed him to survive emotionally and probably physically the horrors of the Nazi death concentration camps. So this question of purpose and meaning cuts to the very core of our existence. And like the poet Mary Oliver's lines in her poem, when she asks us, tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? So maybe after this difficult period we've been in, maybe we can see our desires more clearly. So if it's also on handout 6, if you're using the handouts, but maybe you can take a couple of moments and reflect on Mary Oliver's question. After the pandemic, what is it you want to do? What is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? And if that's a hard question to answer, an alternative method that has been used with actually family physicians in burnout prevention is to think about an experience. And this time we would talk about it as an experience that you during the pandemic that really moved you, that felt touching or meaningful or moving. And take a couple minutes and write about that experience, or tell someone else about that experience. And as you do that, see if it gives you any ideas about your own sense of meaning and purpose. Again, those are things we'd be very interested in people sharing, and we'll have some time to do that. Or Julie, I know you're monitoring kind of chat, so if there's anything you see that you want to interject as we go, feel free to jump in and do that. If not, we will.
Well, the one thing that's kind of come through is people just commenting on what they have really found is most important to them, who's their family and the health of their family is the stuff that's coming through, is what people have really identified as what's most important to them.
Mm-hmm. Our core and our rock often is other people, especially our family. So thanks for sharing that. So that in some ways provides also a segue to the sixth strategy we're talking about here, which is another strategy for thriving, and that is growing in our appreciation and our love. So the first method we would talk about within that is on slide 19, is to really consciously, and so much of what we're talking about today has to do with conscious living, about how do we love more fully. As I mentioned earlier with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's insights at the end of her own death, that for her the purpose in life was growing not only in our wisdom, but also in our ability to give and receive love. And now is also a time, I think, as she advised, when it's more appropriate than ever to grow in our abilities for appreciation and love. And love is something that is, it's one of those things that, one of those rare things that by giving away, it enriches not only those we give it to, but enriches us. And there's actually a lot of research that shows that love is critical for our own growth and happiness and fulfillment. Richard Layard from Great Britain, in a real classic book about summarizing research on happiness, wrote that love is really the central theme that helps people to be happy in their own lives. It makes sense too. I've often heard it said that when people come near the end of their own lives, the regret that most people have is not that, boy, I wish I got a few more work chores, tasks done, or got a few more chores around the house completed, or shop for a few more personal belongings. But the wish that people express most of all is that they had loved more, or loved more fully. So if you're using the handouts, this is on handout 7. So let's just kind of take the prior exercise and try and think about that as a gateway for increasing our abilities to love. So I'd ask you again to think about who is most precious to you. So even try and visualize, imagine that person. And as you see that person, ask yourself, and try and do that in a way that the answer comes from deep in your own heart and mind. How can you express your love more fully to that person? How can you be more loving to them? Maybe it's worth brainstorming. Are there ways that you can try to convey your love that the other person can even more fully appreciate and take in? Sometimes we tend to give to people in other ways that works for us that may not be what individually works for them. But think about that person who's most precious to you? How can you be more loving to that person? There's lots of possibilities. Just to name a few would be some acts of kindness, and those can be the simple daily acts of kindness of doing something for the person, or bringing them something, or doing a chore for them, or cooking or baking them something. For some people, what's most powerful is maybe the more frequent positive verbal expressions of love. Another way we can do that is, again, when we mentioned about loving kindness meditations, we can also focus ourselves during meditation on feelings of love and extending that to person during meditation. So the other thing I would just invite you to think about is, sometimes we kind of guard our love as if it's a scarce commodity, that there's only a little bit of it, so we can only share it with, the people who are closest to us, like our nuclear family. In that way, there's other perspectives that, love is something that can grow and grow. So I would just ask you, are there other ways you can extend your love and kindness to people outside of your most precious circle? How might you be more loving or caring or kind toward other people? How could you do that? What would be the best ways to who would that be, and what might be the best ways to express that? So at this point, and feel free if virtually here, and it's a little hard to gauge kind of how much time people need to think about these things. So, but assuming it's okay to cover the next one, on the next slide, slide 20, we were going to talk about another practice, which is that of gratitude, which works toward appreciation. So gratitude is another one of those, and many people are becoming increasingly familiar with that as the research has become extensive, that practices of gratitude really increase not only your emotional well-being, but also your physical health. And there's a number of different strategies that you can do to practice gratitude. So shown on worksheet 8 and on the slide is to ask you to think about, again, it might be a little difficult to think about because there's been so many stresses, but during these past 16 months of coronavirus and everything else that's been difficult that's happened, can you think of 3 things that you're grateful for? These may overlap with something else of the good things, or they might be different. It might be something that didn't happen, but that you still hold dearly and that you appreciate and are grateful for. So if you will, take a moment and jot down or make a mental list of 3 things that you truly feel grateful for within this past 16 months. So this practice of gratitude right now, I asked you to do that related to the past 16 months and the present moment. It's also something that is a powerful practice that you can do on an ongoing basis. There's research that shows that people who do it every day, or if every day seems too much to do, who do it maybe 3 times a week or even weekly, but take that opportunity to really think about what are you grateful for. It's a way, again, of shifting our mind from the stress, the negativity, the anxiety, the problems, to the positive. One version of that I really like, I heard about a long time ago, is if you do that, try also each time that you do that to write down 3 things you're grateful for, to think about something new that you haven't written about or thought about, noted before. So if you do that, it might seem like a daunting task. And usually what happens is people start with the really big things like I'm grateful for my family, or I'm grateful for my job, or I'm grateful for my dog, or whatever it might be. But over time, if you need to write something new, then you begin to kind of look around more with this wider lens to all the things that are positive in your life that you appreciate. And that the other thing that happens is you go from kind of the general global things, which are important, to much more specifics that allow you to live within the details and the richness of your life. So it may be, rather than I'm grateful for my child, which might be where you start, instead it becomes I'm grateful that today that my 8-year-old son gave me such a big hug or a smile when I got home, or they made a drawing for me, a crayon drawing, and gave that to me. So it allows us again to kind of live our lives in much finer detail in a way that adds more richness. So I'd also just kind of invite people to think about, and you could do that now or in a few minutes, would there be anything you're willing to share in chat or aloud about something that you're grateful for now after these past 16 months of the pandemic and this difficult era we've been in?
So one person put in chat, so everybody, so we can read that. The panelists said, in this order: spending time with my kids, not having to drive them to school, and being able to get CEUs online. So there's some good things to be grateful for. But I also agree, Gary, I think that idea that it's funny that when you start out with these global things, but then when you get to like those small things, they are, even though it's just a tiny thing, like this conversation we had, or that hug, or that smile, even though they're the smaller things, they really like feel more rewarding and are really, versus just those broad stroke globals.
Yeah.
And when you do this over time, it really feels like you get to those more meaningful things, or those small things. Which is really what life is, right? Like just the everyday little stuff.
Yeah.
Somebody else put spending time with my son, having job security, and being able to help others.
Thank you for sharing those, and Julie, thanks for relaying those as well as your thoughts on it. And as you were talking, I also thought about, mindfulness is obviously a very well-known, popular practice these days. And what we just talked about in terms of writing gratitude statements and doing that in something new and different is really a way that allows us to be mindful of our lives in that, again, in the day-to-day living of it. So it's really kind of put legs on the mindfulness concept. Thanks, Julie, for sharing those. So on slide 21, we're going to cover the 7th and final strategy here, and that is facing the quintessential hero's question about what brings you most alive. I mentioned earlier Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who's one of my favorite authors, and one of my most very favorite is Joseph Campbell, excuse me, who wrote prolifically about myths and especially about the hero's journey. And although Joseph Campbell was a seminal scholar, he also focused on how can we put these concepts like the hero's journey into practice in our lives. And I'm oversimplifying here a bit, but the hero's journey involves in part us going through trials and tribulations like we have during the pandemic period, and discovering what is it that brings us most alive. Campbell's thoughts, which makes a lot of sense in my experience, is that we often lose sight of this just within the busyness and the demand of daily life. And that's probably especially true after a time of intense stress, like the pandemic period of these past 16 months. So Campbell suggested that we discover to discover what brings us most alive, we look for those moments or activities where we experience deep happiness or bliss or joy, which often kind of just blip by us as we're rushing about our day. And those can be major activities, sometimes like work, or maybe it's parenting, as some people have mentioned in comments, or maybe it can be simple moments like being out in nature and watching a sunset, or going for a hike, or going for a run outdoors. Truth is that most of us, probably all of us, experience joy in more than one activity. What I'd ask you to think about now, as shown on the slide and on worksheet number 9, is to try and answer for yourself what brings you joy or bliss or deep happiness. And these are the things that can answer what is it that gives you the feeling of being truly alive. What are they can be maybe major things, like your therapist or being with your family, or they can be the small specific activities or events. So take a moment, and I don't know if anyone has seen that before, but there's a really great, it was a PBS special where Bill Moyers interviewed Joseph Campbell, and this is an older one from, I think, the mid or late 1980s, because Joseph Campbell died during that time. But he talks with Campbell talks with Bill Moyer, and he talks about again that we really need to kind of think about, and if we do, we know it. When do you really feel truly alive? Look at your own experience. Maybe sometimes it's just, it's kind of covered up, and we have to kind of hunt and peck for it a little bit. And the signposts for that, or trail posts for that, might be the sense of joy or bliss or happiness. But what is it that really gives you that sense of being truly alive? And when you identify that, I'd ask you to think about, how much time do you spend being that way now? Is it a big portion of your life, or does it kind of get crowded out to the margins as you're busy doing other things that feel necessary or are necessary? And is there a way you can spend more time in the activities that bring you joy and happiness, the things that really help you to feel most alive? So on the next slide, we're going to do one last poll question. And this is about, Kara, if you'd be willing to put that up, which asks you what strategies might be most helpful for you to help you grow and thrive after the pandemic. And those include the prospecting for the positives, the looking for positive silver linings, good things, exercise. Thanks, Kara.
Mhm.
Or growing in your appreciation and love, like learning to love more fully, practicing gratitude, or doing kind of, that's a very simple but fundamental exercise about asking yourself and trying to find what brings you joy, what brings you most alive. So again, as in the last poll question or survey, if you could take a moment and answer those and check any and all of those that seem like they might be of benefit to you.
And it looks like voting has slowed down a bit, so we'll give it like 10 more seconds. Okay, and it looks like the top response was sharpening / affirming your meaning or purpose. Over half responded to that question. Then next was finding what brings you joy / most alive. And
Kara, excuse me, would you be able to share those?
oh, sorry, I forget
Thanks.
there's that extra step there.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So it really close together are practicing gratitude and finding what brings you joy / being most alive. And then after that, pretty close are looking for positive / silver linings, good things exercise, as well as declaring what is precious to you. About half of you picked those. Then next, these two are fairly close, is growing in your appreciation and love and learning to love more fully. And about a third responded to those. And then prospecting the pandemic for positives was next.
Good. Well, that's interesting. And again, that it shows a lot of different strategies work and different things for different people. And with that 10% for prospecting the pandemic, I guess we're all done with that. We're ready to move forward and do other things, which kind of makes sense to me too. So, but it's exciting really to see the things that people put about finding most joy and meaning and purpose and declaring what's precious. So thank you, Kara, for sharing all that.
Sure.
As we move toward kind of wrapping up this part of the webinar, I would like to ask you, and I think that's on slide 23. Years ago, I went to one of these through one of the national groups, the trainers. It was on a mental health therapy, I think, and it was a 1 day or 2 day workshop, but the kind of thing where you pay like $250. And at the end of the time, the trainer said, if you take away one thing, this will be that'll be great. Take away one thing from a training. I'm kind of thinking I paid $250 and spent 2 days, and it's only one thing. But I do think that there is something powerful, and we often do that in meetings, to think about what is one thing that you do want to take away from a meeting, from a training, from an experience. So I would ask you to think about that question about what is one thing you want to take away from today? And can you take it away, and not only in your thoughts, but can you try and put it into practice in your life? We know from other research that if you even formulate a goal or a plan, that you're more likely to put that into action in your life. And that some of the critical steps for making a plan is to think about who can support you in what you're doing. And sometimes just verbalizing, maybe saying to a friend or a family member or a partner, here's what I want to do. I want to practice gratitude. I want to spend more time. I want to make those plans to have more time to connect with people. If we actually take that step of writing it down or sharing with people, then we're more likely to actually do it. And then it's also, again, the literature shows that you're likely to be more successful if you find some way for giving yourself reinforcement for that. Some it can be simple like celebration, or you can tie that in for something else that you want to do. But the most critical part, again, is to ask you, what's one thing you would like to take away from today? And we would invite people to, again, share at this point, and to do that through chat or Julie or Kara, can you remind people, like if they want to, use audio, how they would do that?
Sure. If in the chat they just want to say they have something to say, and when we're ready, we can make their audio. We can unmute their audio.
Anything anybody would be willing to share about one thing they want to take away from today? And Julie, would you be able to monitor responses again?
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Let's see. Someone said one thing is to sharpen what makes me feel alive and put more into it.
Good, interesting. I hadn't thought of that, but I think that's a really good element to that, of not only to sharpen it, but putting the effort or the time or the energy into that to making it happen.
Yeah.
It's a great point.
So that's the only thing that anybody put down so far.
Okay. Well, we can also open it up to any other questions or comments, and then we can pick up if there's anything else somebody adds in. Julie, if you want to just kind of quarterback that part of it.
Someone said, I plan to use this information and exercises in groups with the people they serve, and that they were really helpful and useful, and they appreciate it very much.
Great. Thank you. Good.
Being grateful for small everyday things is something I haven't really thought of before. And someone just commented, Gary, on thanking you that you really have a knack for putting things in perspective in a reassuring way. And people appreciated the handouts and worksheets. Anybody that missed that, they were emailed out this morning. So a couple of people were looking for them. So please, if you didn't get them yet, double check your email because they were emailed out. Let me double check. Searching for joy and deep happiness. I hadn't thought of this before. I'm going to spend some time seeing if I can figure out my joy and deep happiness. And I think it's interesting too, Gary, like on the polls, how, things like meaning and purpose really came to the top when we're thinking about happiness. And those are not, that's not like something that's like, oh, I don't know, something that's not like concrete, or something that's, I'm not finding the right word, something that's simple or easy. It's, sort of like what's, I guess, our values and what's most meaningful, and sometimes even what's the most work at that deeper level kind of maybe connects to our happiness even more than the quick, simple, easy things, although they're nice once in a while too.
Right. No, that's a good point. And I think even culturally, I mean, if you look at media and marketing, advertising kind of stuff, I mean, once in a while you get things that have to do with meaning and purpose, but that doesn't get a lot of attention within our culture per se. And yet, as people indicated, it's really important for people's lives. So, great. Well, I know we're running short on time, so if there's any other questions or comments, we'd be glad to take those. And I also did want to say, just within this, that certainly this is not exhaustive of the strategies and interventions that can be used for dealing with stress and recovering from the pandemic, or growing, or happiness, or well-being. We do have other more extensive resources within the Center of Excellence, Illume, and there's other places too. So if anyone's interested in more information, you can email us. Also, and while being a psychologist and a therapist for many years, also that often sometimes, while education and training is great, we also want to just acknowledge that sometimes people need to work with a individual therapist or counselor, and that can also be really helpful. So if people need that, we certainly encourage that as something that's useful for people, particularly when dealing with some of these difficult situations. Finally, I just want to say thank you to everyone who attended. I really enjoyed the opportunity to talk with people. I wish we could have done it with more visual or in person so we could see faces and be able to interact with people more. And I guess that's, again, one of the fallouts of the pandemic period we've been living in. And it's also been good to be able to still connect with people and talk with people, and appreciate everyone's time and attendance and comments and questions. And with that, I think I'm going to turn it back to Kara, I believe, just for any final information or about CEUs or future trainings. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much, Gary, not only for today, but all that you've done to make Illume and other initiatives possible. So we're really grateful for that. And thank you everybody for attending, and all our panelists for helping out. I really quickly, I wanted to share some of our other upcoming webinars with everyone, just so you all know what we have coming up. We have some hybrid trainings that we'll be offering starting in August. So people can come down to Places for People. We'll have a limited number of spaces for that, but we'll also be offering it over Zoom. For those of you who still don't want to come in person, we definitely understand. And then we have a couple other opportunities in a few months that we still haven't nailed down all the details, but that will be happening. So we just wanted to let you all know to start getting those on your calendars. And you can sign up soon on our website. Feel free to check out our social media to find out more information. And when we have even more training, sometimes we do community-based trainings for clinicians as well. So feel free to check us out on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn. I think we have a couple others, but there's too many social media things to count these days. So I think that's it for our upcoming events. And I get off share here, and then I just wanted to thank everybody again for attending. And when you exit the webinar, you'll be prompted to take a survey, and we really appreciate that feedback. We've really used that feedback over our webinars over this past year to improve our trainings. So please fill that out. And we will be sending out those resources that we talked about earlier to everybody again. And we just want to make sure that, learning and practice doesn't stop here. So please check out those handouts, and don't hesitate to contact us for more information on any further customized trainings, mentoring, or consultation at your agency. I think that's
Hey,
all we
Kara,
have today.
I just have a quick comment. I think the dates on the might have been listed as September for Bart and Karen's trainings instead of August. I got a message that
You're right. I can't seem to figure out dates. Yeah, that was supposed to be August. So I will
could you repeat those one more time, just so people might be able to write them down if they.
Yeah, sure. So COVID in the community is supposed to be August 10th, and then grief and loss is also supposed to be in August. And then trauma and PTSD is supposed to be in September. So those months were just supposed to be moved up. So
Thank you
for catching that.